Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's HDI webinar, Risk the Change or Change the Risk, IT Change and Risk Management. Today's webinar is brought to you by HDI 2018 Conference and Expo, coming to you in lovely Las Vegas, Nevada, April 10th through 13th. The hashtag on social media is HDIConf. And that's the website, and there's also a link to the website in the attachments tab, so you can go and look at the available prices and sessions that are there, the great keynotes that we have coming. Check it out. I'm Roy Atkinson. I'll be your moderator today. We just have a few announcements before we begin. If you are experiencing any technical problems that includes audio, please refresh your web browser. You can stay connected with HDI on social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, Google+. And, of course, we have our members-only website, connect.thinkhdi.com. If you want to learn more about being an HDI member, head over to thinkhdi.com. The slides will advance automatically throughout the presentation, and you can download the slides and other resources by opening the Attachments tab on your BrightTalk screen. Remember that today's webinar will be available on demand shortly after the completion of this live webcast, and you'll receive an email reminder to let you know when it's available. Today's speaker is Greg Sanker, who is an IT service management author, speaker, and practitioner with decades of global IT experience, ranging from a Fortune 10 tech giant to the public sector. An international speaker known for his practical been there, done that advice, Greg often blogs about excellence in service management on the itsmtransition.com website and was recently named a top 25 thought leader in technical support and service management by HDI. His new book, IT Change Management, A Practitioner's Guide, was released in September 2017, and you can see that there's a link to that in the attachment tabs as well if you want to go check out the book. He will be speaking at the HDI conference, session 405, a crash course in change management, and I highly recommend attending that session if change management is what you do or what you're involved in. Check it out. Greg, take it away.
Thank you, Roy. It's great to be here. Today we're going to talk a little bit about risk management as it relates to change. And I start with this statement here. It's not the absence of change, but rather the deliberate application of the right changes that restores balance and maintains stability. And that's something that we need to keep in mind as we move forward with change management, risk management, and the related activities. So we're going to talk about that as we go through. I'm going to start with talking about Alice. This is a true story. A friend of mine was a change manager in an organization. This is one of the stories that she regularly told. Alice lives by herself, and she requires medication, and her healthcare organization delivers her medication weekly. Now, coming closer to our world, where we come from, a change back here in the back office created an undetected problem out here in the scheduling and dispatch center, and that left Alice without her medication. And this is a true story. Alice was unable to get her medication, and when she called the corporation, they were unaware that they had a problem. And so that brings us to a fundamental that how well we manage change risk has a material impact on the businesses that we serve. This is a very real concern for those of us that work in change management. So let's take a look. Let's talk about what is change management overall. And first of all, let me note that it's an organization capability. It's not exclusively a process or any other piece, but it's a capability of your organization to support timely and effective implementation of things that the business wants. Obviously, we have to manage risk, and we'll talk about that and minimizing business impact and unintended consequences here on this webinar. And we need to make sure that those changes that we implement actually achieve what the business intends for them to do, and also make sure that if we have governance and compliance expectations within our environment, that is exactly what we need to make sure that we're taking care of. All right, so with that as a background, it is, let's talk a little bit about how we manage change risk. So we're going to go through these pretty quick. So change-related risk are things like noticeable bad things happen. In other words, you actually notice that something went wrong, right? And there's also the kind of bad things that you don't notice, like Alice and her inability to get her medication. And there's also the situation in which nothing happens. In other words, you complete the change and things just simply aren't working at all. And then there's the situation in which wrong things happen. In other words, the application or the infrastructure or the components that have been changed don't behave as they're intended to behave. And there's also, as many of you know, performance degradation. We implement a change, and then somehow we find ourselves lacking the capacity or the system is behaving in an unacceptably slow fashion. And there's also bad things that happened elsewhere. And this would fall into the category of bad things that we notice, but they happen elsewhere in the organization or within a complex system where maybe we didn't test that part, or maybe we didn't even know that it could impact that. That's another form that we often see. Now, I talk a lot about risk, but let's be really, really clear. When we're talking about change management risk, that is business risk, or risk to the organization that we're serving with our change management. So that when we talk about risk management, evaluation, and risk mitigation in the context of change management, let's keep very, very clear that we are talking about risk to the business. This is not IT risk or technical infrastructure risk. So what are some of those? There could be delay in the realization of value. In other words, the organization could not implement a change that generates revenue for the organization, or there could be loss of credibility, for not meeting commitments or whatnot. There's cost overruns associated with either projects or implementations that we want to manage within their constraints, right? We might miss our stakeholder commitments, and that in this context, I'm thinking about external stakeholders, marketplaces, and whatnot, but also internal customers as well. And then the other obvious risk associated with changes is if we have to send a change back for rework, obviously there's dollars associated with that or costs associated with that, and then project delays. So those are some of the risks that we would care to mitigate. And so let's, before we get too far down the road, I'd like to get a vote from you folks. Let's see, Roy, can you help me make that go live? We have a poll to find out how many of the incidents within your organization actually cause incidents within your organization. Let's see if we can bring that up. I want to get your vote. So as we go forward, we can kind of talk about it in that context.
You should be able to see the poll now, and you should be able to vote. And the question
Awesome.
is, in your organization, what percentage of business impacting incidents are caused by changes? There we go. The votes are coming in. You see those, Greg?
Yes, I got them now.
Okay, good.
We'll give it just a second. I know there's that awkward silence when you guys are all voting, but we in the webinar business call that engagement. I'll give you just a few more moments to complete that. All right. Well, why don't we go ahead and wrap that up? It looks like, and let's see. Hopefully we can make the results viewable, but it looks like about 40% are in the category of 20 to 40%. Slightly less in the 0 to 20, a smaller percentage in the 40 to 60, not a lot suggesting that it's over 60%, and then a fair amount of us, about 10%, are pretty honest in saying, I have no idea. I have no clue what that is, which is probably pretty realistic. The point being that we have a fairly broad spread of what we believe to be true, but there's very few of us that would suggest that it's 0% or a non-critical component of managing changes. There's been a number of folks that speak out on the topic that say that 80% of incidents are caused by change. I'm not sure that I agree with that. But let's just, at this point, suffice it to say that change management, or how we manage changes or not, can have a material impact on the number and severity of incidents within the organization. All right, so back to our slides. Let's talk about managing risk, and there's a pretty straightforward approach. I'm going to list the steps here, and then we're going to go talk in a little bit more detail about it. So we start with identifying what the threats are. They're not risks until we've analyzed them. They're threats. What potential bad things can happen? And when we look at those, we want to be very specific. When we identify threats, we want to be as specific and characterize those as much as we possibly can. We don't want to talk in vague generalities. And then once we've identified what the threats that we believe are relevant, then we want to assess what our vulnerability is to those to the best of our ability. And that would include things like analyzing what our critical assets are, what those specific threats are against that. And also then, once we've identified the threats and our vulnerability to them, is what is the level of risk associated with those specific threats. All right, so when we talk about risk, we are interested in two very specific things. What's the likelihood that this threat will be realized, and what's the impact on the organization or our customers if that happens? And then once we've gotten to that point, then we identify what our risk reduction strategies are. We identify things that we can do to reduce or address those risks. And then finally, and it seems a little bit out of order, but this is the way we do it, is we want to prioritize what our risk reduction efforts are. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that's at the tail end when we get to that in the presentation. All right? So moving forward is identifying threats. So how do we do that? What things are we looking for? Well, first of all, we just start with asking ourselves the question of what could possibly go wrong. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? So what has happened in the past? What have we seen in the past? Most of us involved with change management have some technical expertise from the past, and we have some history within the organization of certain upgrades, certain installations, certain application releases tend to cause more problems than others. And that's how we can help identify what the likely threats are associated with that. Again, I'm going to continue to emphasize we want to be specific, and I'll talk more about why we need to be that specific towards the end of the presentation. We want to engage our subject matter expert. What do they believe are the threats? They tend to be the ones that have the best view to what those bad things can happen. I was in an organization once when an update to a PC application caused a significant issue with a back-end database that required 6+ hours of redoing the database to catch up with that. I talked to the senior database analyst, and I said, so if had you seen this, had you had the opportunity to look at this, would you have been able to identify this as a threat? And he said, absolutely. Right, so that's the kind of things where you want to get your subject matter experts involved, right? So people like your developers, your system analysts, your network administrators, information security, and then ask, what keeps the business awake at night? What is the business worried associated with IT delivery of projects or changes and whatnot? So this is some of the ways that we can identify what our threats are. And obviously there's more, but this gets you thinking in the right direction of it needs to be kind of a comprehensive brainstorming, if you will, or identification based on a solid knowledge base of what could potentially go wrong in terms of a change, right? So let's take a look. So this is on the worksheet, and I have uploaded this worksheet that you're free to download. Many of you will do this within a tool, but let's identify a change. So I'm going to use one that I recently had in a workshop, which is we're going to install an upgrade to a student information system. right? So we want to identify what kind of a threat might be associated with that. So one of the threats that we identified was, well, the new system could be incompatible with older browsers that are in use, right? And that's something that we in IT deal with quite a lot, depending on how tightly we control our environment, right? So once we've identified that as a threat, now you notice that there was line number 2, and there could be 3, 4, 5, 6. There could be a dozen or more. I'm just running you through the example, but the point being, we're not just analyzing the risk in a general sense. We want to identify what are the specific threats, and then we'll go through those. So if you have a half dozen or more associated with changes, especially significant changes, then that's completely appropriate. In fact, not only appropriate, it's desirable. So our next step is to assess what our vulnerability is to those threats, right? So we look at things like, are our systems fragile to this type of threat? Are we vulnerable to that? Is that something that we can be impacted by, or are our systems really not vulnerable to that? Do we understand how the system, the capital system, do we understand how it's connected? So as our systems get more and more complex, as we're bringing in cloud applications, as we have multi-vendor, multi-site, complex applications where we're front-ending legacy applications and things like that, do we truly understand how this change in this one area impacts all other areas? And increasingly, the answer is, generally speaking, no, we don't. So we're taking a balanced risk, right? So that's a question we need to ask ourselves is, could something bad happen that we haven't foreseen or haven't seen in the past, right? And the other things, there's two here. Are there any critical business functions being supported, and is there sensitive information involved with the change system? If those are the case, often you upgrade your threat level, because if something bad were to happen in these key areas, that's really bad. You know, there's bad and there's really bad, right? So that's something that you want to look at. And also, of course, your governance risk and compliance or control implications. Is there PCI data, HIPAA data, FERPA data if you're in the education? There's a lot of standards, SOX and whatnot. Are there implications in those environments? Are we touching components that will impact those? And if so, then we need to make sure that we're dealing with risk appropriately. Okay, now, if we want to then go and look at the risk, as I said earlier, there's two main things that we look at, and this is per threat. We want to look at how likely it is to occur and what's the impact to the organization if it does. Now, I'm showing a 3x3 matrix. I've seen 1 to 10 matrices, and I've seen all kinds of really complex algorithms. Obviously, you need to do what is appropriate in your environment or for your organization. But the idea is that those two factors influence what the overall risk level of a given threat really can be. So, for instance, let's take a look at this one. So this is also on that worksheet, which you're free to use, right? So by determining risk, let's go back. We have a threat that says that our new system might be incompatible with older browsers and are in use, right? So we ask ourselves, how likely is that to happen? And you show that there's a little red X that showed up around medium. That's the assessment of our technical experts in the organization that says that is not really, really highly likely, and it's not unlikely. It's kind of in the middle, right? Well, what about the impact if that happens? Well, we took a look at the environment and said, well, it's actually a moderate level of impact, because there might be students, for instance, instructional staff that are unable to process grades or do other business required functions, depending on the time of day, depending on the day of the week, of the month and the year, and that sort of stuff, grading periods and whatnot, right? So if we map that over here on the matrix, this is pretty straightforward stuff, right? You map medium to medium, and we wind up with, not surprising, a medium level risk. But the emphasis here is this is the risk of this one particular threat. And you would do this for all the threats that you've identified, so that you could determine that we have some threats that are pretty low, and we have some threats that are pretty high in terms of their overall risk level. And it's from there that we determine what our actions should be. All right, so let's turn now to risk mitigation, which is our strategy that we're going to employ to actually address what those risks are. So And here we're looking at things like, can we proactively eliminate the threat? And again, this is threat by threat by threat, each individual one. So this would be specific things that we might be able to do to eliminate or reduce what the threat is. And then there's, secondarily, are there things that we can do to reduce the business impact if the threat actually does occur? In other words, what proactive steps can we either eliminate or reduce the impact of it? And the other thing is we kind of have to run them through the filter of, is it realistic? Is the mitigation strategy we're proposing realistic, and is it reasonable? And the reason I put those in is because we can dream up, in theory, lots and lots of great things that we could potentially do to mitigate risk or reduce risk. We could even attempt to try to drive it down to zero, but in reality, the cost associated with doing that, the time delay associated with doing that, is probably not worth the business value that it gets at the end of the day. So it's always a balance. Now, the other thing is, of those wild, great ideas that we dream up, has that strategy been tested? And if it has been tested, has it been tested recently? And while we're talking about testing, testing is often used as an indicator into the CAB or the change management process of this change has low risk because it's been tested in test. Now, the question that you would need to ask yourself is, how representative is your test environment to your production environment? And you could go even as far as saying, okay, the work stream or the value stream for, say, your mainframe applications or your PC applications or your web applications or your core, COTS or web, SaaS solutions, are those various work streams, are they all similar in terms of the risk associated with them? So this is us developing our change capability over time. So if we know that, say, for instance, our web applications are containerized all the way through start to finish, and we've tested and tested, and what happens in production is exactly what happens in test, then we have a really good idea and a reasonably high confidence that while these bad things could happen, we already have controls in place to address those. Whereas perhaps on a PC application or a legacy application that's a bit more fragile, where we, heaven forbid, I know nobody actually would admit to this, but maybe we don't have a good test environment, maybe we don't have a test environment at all outside the developer's desktop. And that raises the risk level to the point where we're not sure how it's going to behave in production, and so we may want to treat those differently. So you get the idea, right? So let's go back to our example, right? So we have this threat, the new system incompatibility with older browsers, and we come up with a mitigation strategy that says, well, we could take an inventory of all the installed browsers and make sure we test against everything that's in use, right? That's a reasonable thing that we can do. It's also something that's easier said than done, right? Because in real life, if we were that proactive in managing the environment, we probably already would have kept all of our browsers current. So, out in real life, we maintain older browsers because certain legacy applications may require them, because certain PCs can't be updated for various reasons, or there's geographical issues associated with those kind of updates. There's a lot of reality. However, if we believe that this is, and I don't want you to focus on the specifics of my example, I want you to focus on the concept that if we have identified a mitigation strategy, then is that likely, is it reasonable to actually produce positive results? And in this case, I would suggest that could potentially produce good results. Now, we haven't said we're going to do that because there's another step that we need to do first before that is, and that is, where are we going to focus our efforts on our risk mitigation, right? So it stands to reason that risks that are higher receive more mitigation planning. Are we prioritize those risks that are either highly likely to happen or highly impactful if they do, or heaven forbid, both of those, making it a substantially high risk change to be moving forward with. And I want to emphasize here that it is the business that determines the appetite for risk within an organization. So, for instance, in our student information system, and I don't want to push this example too far, but obviously in school systems, there's a seasonality to it. And in the workshop that I led, the team suggested Christmas break would be a great time to do the change, and we're suggesting that we could mitigate risk by doing it over the holidays. Well, some of the IT staff were former in-class instructors who said that's the worst possible time because that's when instructors have to enter their grades for the end of the grading period. So that would be the worst possible time. So understanding what the seasonality is can help you focus your mitigation. So for instance, you can say, we're going to wait and do this update not during one of these critical time frames or whatnot. And also the idea that if there's critical functions or sensitive information, then the business should be engaged with when would be an appropriate time to be touching that because the risk level may be unduly high. So for instance, you probably wouldn't want to update an accounts receivable system when you're heading into a month end or a year end close. That would be something where you would say, yeah, you know what, we're pretty sure that bad things aren't going to happen, but we think that it's not worth the risk. Let's just not do that at all at this sort of time. Or there could be a month end or close end or a time window that's been a commitment to stakeholders where we say, yes, we accept the risk. We know it's high risk, but we're going to do it because the upside to the business is significantly high that we actually move out there. But we're looking at that because we understand that it's supporting critical business functions or is managing sensitive information. And of course, there's financial concerns, right? So when we're looking at where we're going to focus our risk mitigation efforts, we IT people can be very analytical and we can be very creative and come up with a lot of really good ideas that could mitigate risk. Unfortunately, if they're all executed and we drive our risk level down to a very, very low level, we've also invested a tremendous amount of calendar time or delays of implementing that change, or we've implemented or we've consumed a great deal of human capital or financial investment in making those mitigation factors come to life. And that's a decision that the business needs to decide is what level of investment is it worth to balance the risk versus the reward. All right, stand to reason, right? Now, this is where the pieces start coming together because I've been emphasizing from the beginning that we need to look at very specific risk and we need to look at them in clear terms. And the reason is as part of the change management life cycle or the loop that brings us from beginning to end and back again is if there's an implementation of a change, and especially if there's a change that didn't go well or created an incident or major incident, is you want to do a post-implementation review. And during that post-implementation review, we want to specifically look at, did we properly identify what the threats were? And that's where we go back and look at the homework that we actually did when we're analyzing the threats associated with that. Did we come up with the one that actually happened? And if we did we appropriately identify what the risk level was? Was the impact to the business higher than we anticipated? Did it happen more likely than we thought we would? And we have the opportunity to look at that. And if we did identify the threat and identify the risk level, then did we focus our mitigation efforts appropriately on that, and were the mitigation efforts successful? Now, the fact that we're talking about a failed change or something bigger, chances are it didn't go as well as it could. So that's where we talk about the opportunity to improve the quality of changes. You know the work of Deming and the idea that we need to engineer quality into the end-to-end process. Well, this is part of how we actually accomplish that. Change management, when it's serving its useful purpose or the rightful place for change management, isn't a last check out the door. They make sure we screw it in, not screw it up. But actually manage the life cycle becomes a powerful feedback loop, which is a phrase that you've heard from the world of continuous integration and continuous flow that is so critical to being successful is if we haven't been specific in the analysis of risk and the mitigating factors and what the risk levels are, then we're not going to get the valuable feedback on how well we're managing that, right? This becomes the data that we use for specific process and technical improvements within our development environments. And by development, I don't mean exclusively software, but where it is that we develop changes and how we bring changes into production. And that's where it intersects with your continuous flow and continuous integration is we are trying to improve the pipeline or the flow process from beginning to end of change management. So this is not old school change management. This moves us all the way into DevOps, Agile, Scrum, etc. But the idea is change management needs to elevate itself from just a last check out the door and let's hope for the best into an actual feedback mechanism that improves our capability over time. Notice that I call it a capability here on the slide because change management, again, is not exclusively a process, though there are processes, but it's an organizational capability to bring about things that your organization wants. And I, once upon a time, wisely sent this out into the Twitterverse. As change management matures, it must loosen its grip on the individual RFCs and increase its focus on engineering change quality into the overall development cycle. And that is actually the end goal of change management, is to improve our change capability over time. That brings us to where we at for questions. So if you have questions, it looks like there's some in the queue, but if you have questions that you would like to see addressed, things that you would like to hear me respond to or where you agree or disagree with me, nicely, of course, I would love to hear that now. And I think Roy is actually going to pull those out.
I am indeed, sir. And you partially addressed this question, and I think this is one that's on a lot of minds these days with the increasing popularity of DevOps approaches and Agile approaches. This question says, with DevOps, this seems obsolete. Can you explain how this fits into continuous flow context?
Great. I love that question, and thank you for being honest or blunt with it. Yeah, DevOps is a game changer, to be sure. There's no doubt about that. And I know that change management, it kind of gets in the crossfire of traditional service management versus DevOps and all that. And I know that some of you get involved with that, and you're involved with out there. The challenge that we face with change management is we have governance, risk, and compliance obligations that we have to meet to external standards in many organizations. And changes are not exclusive to software, which seems to be the domain of DevOps as a methodology. It's not exclusive, I realize that, but it's much, much better fitted to that form of a development flow. And so what challenges that we face out in real life is we have parts of the organization that are doing DevOps and an abbreviated form of change management associated with that. And in other areas, there's more traditional changes, maybe for mainframe or firewall changes or some other things that don't fit into the traditional DevOps purview. So does this seem obsolete? Obviously, since I'm suggesting it, I don't think it's obsolete. I think what it is a realistic view of how you get your change management up and out of ground zero, of looking at the nuts and bolts of each and every request for change that's coming through the organization and start focusing in on the end-to-end process. Because change management, when it's done in this fashion, where you're looking at what the actual risks are and is the pipeline, is the mechanism for delivering changes from left to right or improving the quality of changes out the end, if we're improving that pipeline overall, then change management is doing its job. And that is where I see change management. Change management definitely fits in the DevOps world. It is one of the feedback loops, in my opinion. And when it's implemented like that and realized like that, then it's not bureaucratic, slow, or obsolete at all. It just becomes part of the flow. I will put a caveat on in there is, and I have a graphic that I often use when I speak about this, and that's the kinked garden hose. If change management becomes a point at which, like a traditional cab, where changes stop, even for a brief period of time, it is by definition a bottleneck, and it may become, per theory of constraints, it may become the bottleneck, in which case it has to be addressed in terms of flow. And so you never want your change management to move into that space, or if it is already in that space, you want to do everything you can to get out of that space. And that's partly why change management needs to move upstream and be looking at these changes before they even go into the pipeline. Hopefully that addresses that. It's a good question.
Thank you. This is a comment more than a question. Somebody has volunteered to be a heckler for your conference session. So just letting you know.
Oh, awesome.
There's somebody out there that always happy to be Greg's heckler. So
send me an email so I'll know who to look for.
Okay. There's two questions that I think can be rolled up into one. And one is, does focusing on the threat by threat by threat negatively impact or paralyze people's positive action to mitigation of risk? And the other one that I think is very similar, it says, doing this much analysis for each change request seems very bureaucratic. This is only going to slow down business delivery. So can you address that?
Yeah, and I'll see if I can attach them together. So first of all, I applaud that your main concern is that your customer is going to be damaged by the things that we're talking about here. That is the right point of view, obviously. And then the other piece is there's a lot that I've suggested that we do. If we literally work out each individual change and put a half dozen threats associated with it, that's a lot of administration, we'll put it that way, right? And it also can tend to make people standoffish. It's like, you know what, I'm not going to submit an RFC because they're going to make me write up a lot of paperwork and blah, blah, blah. I'm just going to slip this in, right? Circumvent the process because the process is painful. Neither of those are things that we want to do. Those are not the directions we want to go. So this is where we take a cue from the DevOps world or the Agile world is if we are singularly focused on delivering value to the customer and improving the process, a continuous feedback loop, then this becomes part of how we actually go about doing that. It doesn't need to be bureaucratic. You're free to download the piece of paper, but frankly, this can be done fairly quickly through whiteboards, through implementation of tools. I'm not a big fan of using tools to do these core features, but if your tools have that, it becomes a little bit of a more of a checkbox activity where you're actually focused on getting the outcome achieved at the end. And I think that really is kind of the focus. One of the things that we really have to be realistic about, and this gets into the cultural element of blameless culture, because significant outages that are caused by incidents, and I've worked with several organizations that have had major outage, multi-hour outages of major core critical functions for changes that were listed as low risk, and for systems that were declared that didn't have production data on them, that actually brought down some very visible to the public of that organization. So very, very, very impactful. So my question is, did the business owner whose business process or profitability or revenue commitments to the organization, was that individual aware that their ability to continue their business at risk because a change was implemented within the IT infrastructure? And in this organization, the answer was they weren't. They weren't because the specific risks weren't identified and the core business functions weren't identified. It was being viewed primarily as a technical change within the infrastructure, right? So as we focus on our business and the value that they create and the impact that IT changes can have to the business, both positive and negative, then this changes the balance just a little bit. The other piece is, as we mature our capability around change management, some of these risks will be included in the change models, which we'll talk about that some other day, or in some of our standard changes, we will have built into the process that we've learned the hard way through what I'm talking about here, that how we do changes or the change models with which we do changes incorporate those risk mitigation factors into the environment. And the other piece, and I still have a little bit of time, the other piece is this is good feedback, strong data feedback for infrastructure and other investments that the organization can make to make the organization itself more resilient. If you have vague generalities like changes cause problems, there's no actionable data there. But if we can say that we've identified these risks and we repeatedly realize these and we don't have effective mitigation strategies to address these, and therefore we suggest that to reduce business impact, we should be making these investments in resiliency, redundancy, and other investments that the organization can make. So it can seem like a lot of work, but it's the opportunity that we have to actually improve our change capability. That was long-winded. Sorry about that, Roy.
No, that's absolutely fine. We have ample time for Q&A today, and I was actually just going to ask you to elaborate a little bit. You alluded to the fact, you mentioned standard changes.
Yes.
And I think that's a key component of your view of how change management can be streamlined. Can you just talk about that a little bit since we have a little bit of time today?
I'd love to talk about that. So there's three things that we can use to optimize a quote-unquote traditional change management. That would be standard changes, delegated change authority, and change models. And we can talk about those, how those are actually done in specifics at some other time. But standard changes, most of us understand that standard changes have a documented process that your change management capability has reviewed, and essentially said, look, if you do that kind of change in that fashion, then that doesn't need to come to change management in a formal review. Just do that operationally. Now, that doesn't mean, that doesn't give the organization license to do whatever. It gives the operations team license to do those specific changes in that way as needed to meet business objectives. And the reason I emphasize in that way is baked into the in that way is addressing the specific risks that change management is legitimately concerned about. So standard changes should be implemented as far as the organization will let it. And I don't have a guideline for how many of your changes should fall under the standard change category. But my answer would be, for most organizations, it's more than you're currently doing, because that is really key. Now, the other one is a delegated change authority, and that is pretty much exactly what it sounds like, but it starts with a fundamental concept of there is an authority that can authorize changes, and the reason there has to be an authority is because the organization in approving changes is actually taking on organizational risk, and that organizational risk could be life, it could be financial, it could be ethical or credibility of the organization, all very, very much business decisions or business risks that need to be managed by appropriate level people in the organization. That one change that I alluded to earlier, where IT staff had implemented a change that it greatly impacted the organization's ability to generate our bank revenue, was definitely a change that was approved by the wrong level of authority because the level of risk that was being undertaken was not well understood and not elevated to the proper level. So standard changes are one way to build that into it. Now, delegated authority is that recognition that there is that hierarchy, and some changes, in fact, most change authorities should be pushed down as low as it possibly can be. It requires there to be a clear level of understanding of what is at risk by this change or changes of this type or changes to these systems or these portions of the infrastructure, and who in this organization is authorized to approve those kind of changes or to put the organization into that level of risk and approve that. And those are usually not IT people, or if they are IT people, then they're operating under the authority of somebody else that says, look, we want you to manage on a day-to-day basis and keep us between the rails. Now, change models are the last piece of that trifecta of making sure that we've optimized our change management, and that is where we have changes that are similar in nature, but the particulars may be different. And my go-to example for that is always server decommissions. If we decommission servers, the applications, the parts of the infrastructure, the business functions, all of those things are different. But if we can mitigate risk, and I did this in one organization where I was the change manager, we actually decommissioned a server, unplugged it, and rolled it out in the hall. Yes, this is before we had virtual servers. And it brought down some significant business functions. And when it was reviewed at change management, it was described as, this is an obsolete server, there's nothing running on it, and so there really is no risk. Well, it turns out that was not only true, it was significantly not true. And so we built a change model that said, look, whenever we decommission server, let's follow the same process. And that process is to shut down network services first. Let that sit for a number of days. And then turn down the server, but leave it in place. And then we had this whole stage thing where we move it further and further away. And the idea being is, if you turn off network services and bad things happen, we can quickly turn those back on. If you now, after we've passed some time, chances are good we have a low-risk situation, so then we would actually turn the server dark and then is very unlikely that if there's no network services running and no one's trying to access it, then you're probably safe to do that, right? So you're mitigating risk, but it's all enumerated in the change model. And there's lots of other reasons to use change models. But that's a really good example of changes that are managed in that fashion do not go up to the glorious big cab in the sky, which we should be de-emphasizing materially, so that change management can be more concerned about the flow and less about those individual requests for change.
Okay, thank you. Another good question here. Is it okay to allow the business to decide on their changes that they're requesting even without proper planning or testing?
Wow, that's a loaded question. Well, so let's just be honest. That happens all the time. And because we're in the customer service or the service business, we tend to try to say, yeah, we'll do that, recognizing that there are some material issues with that. So I won't give a Pollyanna-ish response to that, but in reality, if change management is elevated to the proper level and is focusing on the right level, we should be partnering with the business. The business should always be expressing what its flavor for risk that they're willing to do. So in that case of the business says do it, so we're going to just do it, is we all know that potentially bad things are going to come from that because we haven't done sufficient testing, we haven't analyzed what the risks are, and we all feel like that probably something's bad is going to happen. And when it does, then we fold our arms and say, see, told you so. And so we're creating a barrier of sort. Rather than creating a horizontal flow, we're creating a wall over which things jump, and we're separating us from the business. So ultimately the answer is building those right relationships so that the business gets to have the opportunity to say, look, we're really concerned about the speed of delivery. And that's a decision that the business is empowered to make. That's their call to make. What they need to understand is, and here's the risk of moving at that speed or bypassing these fundamental processes that are so key to effectively managing risk, so that the conversation doesn't come us versus them, or of course IT wants to do everything slow and bureaucratic where the business wants to move fast. It's IT is charged with a certain level of risk management. And we all know the thing that all of you are thinking is, and when that bad things happen, they blame IT for the results of a decision that was made by the business. And that's all true, and I've lived that just like you guys have. So the answer really is in building the right relationships and establishing more of an end-to-end flow and less of the cab at the end, because that invariably gets viewed as IT being IT and wanting to slow everything down. And we've done that. We've earned that reputation. And so we need to migrate ourselves upstream and get in the point where we're focused on business value. And that's why when I showed you that slide of what are the goals of a change management capability, it was all about things that we were doing for the business. We're enabling the business. We're managing risk. We're managing negative impacts. We're making sure that their GRC requirements are met. We're not making sure that they follow the process. We're not making sure every RFC is reviewed by the change, inquisition board. No, that's not its proper name, but it feels like that sometimes, right? So it's a long-range answer. It's a really good question that reflects that you live out in the real world, and I hear you. I totally hear you.
Thank you, sure. And just to make that explicit, there's a question here that says, what's the view on CABs, Change Advisory or Authorization Boards?
Yeah, so it's a love-hate relationship. The problem that I see is usually when I get asked or take a look at a CAB. Now, let's be clear. CAB, as it's designed in the IT service management world, is supposed to be an advisory board. So in many cases, it's not an advisory board, it's an approval board. And so that's a misstep. Change Advisory Board should advise those who are making change decisions of what the level of risk is, what the appropriateness of the planning and the coordination, and have we addressed those relevant details. And I will increasingly say that conversation needs to happen before that work item is put into the funnel at the beginning of your sprint or however you're doing that, because those things can be addressed there. We really want to get to the point where change is part of the process of dropping them in the hopper, and in doing so, we have a high degree of certainty of what quality is going to come out the far end, so we don't actually have to stop and look at it. if you think about Demings and the Toyota, the manufacturing process, where we don't inspect every single item that comes off the end of the line, which is essentially what we're doing when we have a traditional cab that says, hey, before you implement tonight or tomorrow, whatever, make sure you bring it to cab. What we're really doing is saying, okay, we've had no influence or control over how it was developed, how it was tested, whatever. We're just doing a quick huddle and saying, hey, let's make sure we don't really screw something up here, right? Which is the most ineffective way to manage change quality that you could possibly do. And so we need to get away from that, and we need to get change management involved in understanding what is the quality of the workflow, where are our issues, what are the work streams that need the most improvement, and where specifically can we make those investments as organizational capabilities or infrastructure that will have the biggest change in the quality that comes off the end. And you don't do that by beefing up your cab at the end of the process. So that's my view on cab. In my view, cab should become mostly an oversight board that doesn't look at specific changes, but is looking more at the change capability of the organization. And so if you have a cab that's comprised mostly of technical experts and the people that are actually going to be doing the work, and especially if it's all comprised of IT people and not business people that are focused on what is it that the change is trying to accomplish and what are we trying to do here, then you've put yourself in a severe disadvantage in moving upstream, as I like to call it, and affecting the quality as it goes in. That's my view on cab.
Thank you. Here's an interesting one. Have you ever used risk management analysis or decision-making responsibility as a reward or recognition for performance level on individuals?
Wow. Not entirely sure what that means or where you're going at, but I can say I've not really seen that. The one thought that I might have is, are you suggesting that elevating somebody in the position where they're doing more risk management, broader, big picture kind of stuff, as a reward or recognition of expertise or their dedication to quality along the process? And I would say that would make them excellent candidates. So if that's where you're going, I would say yes, that's a good idea. But I'm not sure exactly where you're going with that question. So maybe you can hit me offline and give me a little more backstory on that one.
Thank you, sir. How does change risk correspond to service catalog?
So my first thought is that there's not a direct correlation, which of course is the wrong answer. I kind of see them in different spheres, but as you define your services, which would be what would show up in your service, or maybe more accurately your service request catalog, is how that service is managed and to what degree of uptime and availability has direct impact on how change management of that service is implemented. And I think that might be where the question is going. So for instance, in your service catalog, it may cover specific things like hours of operation. So if we have a service that's said to be available, 8 to 5 days a week, then you would never want to make a change during that period of time, even an emergency change, unless you really, really had to, right? So that could be part of it in there as well. But I can say if a service is designed or documented in business terms, as I suggest it should be, then change management has specific guidance from which it can derive, how it makes operational decisions. So, for instance, when I talked about is it supporting critical business functions and is sensitive data being managed by this service or the infrastructure components, those can be documented in your service descriptions or in the service documentation that says because the system has PCI data, all changes must be XYZ, ABC, and so on and so forth, and can actually point to your change policy or other documents that describe management's intention for how pieces of that component can be managed. More often, I see in organizations that a service catalog is not a lot more, and if you're more sophisticated than this, then please don't be insulted, but I see many organizations, and frequently your service catalog is nothing more than I need email, I need this application, and that sort of thing, and not a lot of the broader service components like what is the business function that we're supporting, and how does that fit into the overall, the enterprise architecture and how the pieces fit together. Which is not a bad thing. If customers know how to get what they need, that's a good place to start. But that leaves change management with almost nothing from which they can derive some operational decision making.
Thank you. One more question. My company has risk analysis built into our ITSM tool, and it's nothing like this. Is this a new approach? Or are we doing it wrong?
I try very hard not to tell anybody that they're doing anything wrong, because if you're meeting the needs of your organization, then you're doing the right thing. That can mean that you're doing some things that are outside of best practices or standard guidance, and you need to be aware of that, because when you listen to people who talk about best practices and guidance, they're going to be consistent with that fairly. But more to the point, I think that how tools implement that risk analysis function can vary greatly. Most tools vendors will say, we can do whatever it is that you want in terms of risk analysis, but may have an out-of-the-box or templated, you can choose A, B, or C or whatnot. And I, in all my speaking, I really avoid speaking specifically about tools, vendors, who's better, who's worse, or how they're configured. But all of the major tools that I've seen can be configured to reflect however you want it to do, and they're very supportive of that. So what I think that you're getting at is, in your organization, at some point in time, your tool was implemented in a way that reflects a different view of risk management or risk analysis, and that's not uncommon. A very common approach to change risk analysis is to simply say, is it low, medium, or high? And it's simply based on the expertise of those that are implementing. So the last 6 times that we updated, whatever the application or whatever the change is, did it go well? Did it have some problems? Did it have no problems? Right? And that is a little bit more along the lines of, so if that's what your experience is, then just simply catching, well, what do you think it is important. The problem is you've deprived yourself of the opportunity to do that continuous improvement, or to go back and look and say, well, why did we consider it low? What factors did we include, and what was our thinking, which would be part of the continuous improvement. So I'm not going to tell you that you're doing it wrong. I will say that in the body of work around risk management, which has its own ISO standard, which escapes me right this moment what the standard is, but you can look whatever the standard is around risk management, and this is the typical approach: is identifying what your threats are, identifying what the risk level with those, and identifying what your mitigation. It also heavily overlaps with project management. If you have a PMO or PMP minded folks, there tends to be projects will have a risk matrix that says what are the risks and how are we addressing them in the project. This is very, very similar in how you do that. So I won't say it's something new. It's certainly not something new. It may be new that you're doing it within your organization, or that you're asking your tool to help facilitate that. And it may require some reconfiguring of your tools, which, depending on your size of the organization, can be a fairly large undertaking. So, focus on what you're trying to achieve first before you go to the tools.
Thank you ever so very much for that. Here's a little bit follow-up. We're getting short on time now, but if you can answer this fairly quickly, that'd be great. As are standard changes the same as service requests, since risks are already reviewed and known?
That's a really good question. Service requests. Wow, I'm trying to figure out how to answer that in short order. They're not the same from a capability standpoint, but in practice they often are. So when there's a new account setup, for instance, that's a typical service request. I need a new email account, or a file share, or access to the accounts payable system in this or that role, or security group, those kind of things. Typically, the operating practices around those are documented. And are followed fairly consistently, because those things have security and other impacts on them. I don't often see those being viewed as standard changes, though they really should be. Some organizations consider standard changes to be, look, these are so small that we don't even want to see them, and that's not the right approach. You do want to see them because you want to make sure that you're managing risk. So I guess the direct answer to your question is no, they're not one and the same, but in practice, they generally are.
Thank you. Just a reminder, if you can take a minute to rate this webinar, it's very helpful for us going forward to know how we did and what we can do to continually improve how we present things to you. And I'd also like to remind you that our next webinar will be on March 20th. We present webinars every month on the third Tuesday of the month. So join us a month from now on March 20th, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much to our presenter today, Greg Sanker, for taking the time to share his wisdom with us. We much appreciate that, Greg. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, sure. This webcast is copyright 2018 by United Business Media, LLC. The presentation materials are owned by or copyrighted, if that's the case, by HDI, which is solely responsible for its content, and the individual speakers are solely responsible for their content and their opinions. On behalf of HDI, thanks for your time and have a great day.